I want to give thanks to Caroline Brewer for her introduction, and I want to give thanks to each and all of you who've taken the time to be here today. I'm going to just point out my middle name is Scott, and I point that out because I was named after my great uncle, Emmett J. Scott, who was the last administrator of Howard University before Mordecai Johnson came as the president, and was also the assistant secretary unofficially of troops during of Negro troops during World War I, and was part of the Tuskegee machine, having served as Booker T. Washington's secretary. So in a sense, my whole family's history in terms of education is a very deep one and rich one in the United States of America, and I strongly stress always my middle name of Scott, Graylin Scott Hagler. Now, Graylin came from a soap opera where you had the first black character on a soap opera that was around 1954. So the only Graylins I've met have been born around 1954. Obviously, they were looking at that same show that my godmother was looking at and was impressed by that name. But it's good to be here, and it's glad to have each of you here. And we're here today because of the children in public schools, the children in DC public schools, the children who didn't ask to be here or to even come into this world, but they're here. They didn't ask to be born into a certain neighborhood or to certain parents or to go to even certain schools, but they are here. They're here with their smiling faces and innocence and inquisitive eyes. They're here. They are here with great expectations and high hopes, and I can't and we shouldn't turn our back on their desires to grow and their desires to be successful. I'm asking you to join me in fighting for what's right for our children. I'm asking you to care enough to open your minds and open your hearts, and then do something to begin to agitate and lift up the need to begin to change the status quo. Because one thing that we're realizing is that as we go around the city, nobody really wants to question what is going on. The question becomes, do you support the chancellor or don't you support the chancellor? Well, that's not the issue. The issue is not supporting or not supporting the chancellor. The issue is, are we actually getting done in our public schools what we claim to be getting done? Is it actually taking place? Is it actually serving the young folks in our schools? Or are we just, in a sense, cooking the books, shuffling the numbers, and trying to make something look like what it's not? The children we're fighting for, therefore, are poor. Children we are fighting for have been subjected to statistics. The children that we're fighting for, they're black and they're Latino. Some of the children we're fighting for, they can barely read or write, and that's a sin of public education. Some are in the 6th grade and can't read, and some are in the 10th grade and can't read, and some have just graduated and really can't read. They live in neighborhoods that might have a school they walk to one year, and then all of a sudden the next year it is closed down. The neighborhood is changed, and basically the school is abandoned. The schools in their neighborhoods disproportionately have inexperienced teachers, and a good number of these new teachers quit weeks or months into the school year, leaving the children with aides or long-term substitutes. And the children we're fighting for can tell you that when the teacher leaves, very little learning takes place. In fact, the children we are fighting for often fall further behind. The children we're fighting for, they need more than we're giving them right now. They want more than we're giving them right now, and they're demanding more. If the children we're fighting for could tell us what they want, I'm sure they'll tell us they want the same thing that children on the other side of town already have, and that they received without even asking. That they received because of the societal status of their parents and their families. The children we're fighting for will tell us they want to learn. Like the children on the other side of town, they want to be seen as naturally smart. Like the children on the other side of town, they want to be taught how to do math and science well, just like the children on the other side of town. The children we're fighting for didn't ask the school chancellor or the mayor or any defender of the status quo to mislead the public about how they're really doing. But that's what the mayor and the chancellor have done. The children we're fighting for are being deliberately shortchanged. On September 24th, I gave a speech, The Emperor of School Reform Has No Clothes. I explained that when defenders of the DC school reform strategy, which is rooted in the national test and punish school reform strategy, claims it's working, they're playing games. They're hiding critical information. The defenders chiefly rely on the fact that from 2011 to 2013, DC public school scores averaged on the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP, increased by 5 to 8 points on a 500-point scale in reading and math. The defenders talk about those 2 years, but they've been in charge for 6 years. So how can you talk simply about 2 years when you've been there for 6? And when you look into those 6 years, what you see is that the 4th and 8th grade averages for higher income students in reading increased 28 points, but they increased only 2 points for low income students. You see, for Latinos, there was just a 1-point increase, and for black students, there was no increase. Let me say that again, for 6 years, for low-income students, there was 2 points increase, for Latinos, a 1-point increase, and for black students, there was no increase. The achievement gap got substantially worse in math as well. So when the school chancellor says, as she has repeatedly, that we're on the right track, the data states otherwise. When the school chancellor gives us a handful of antidotes of success against a landscape of failure, as she did in her recent State of the School address, I have to respond. The chancellor, Mayor Gray, Michelle Reed, and Adrian Fenty implemented a devastating reform strategy for the children it was supposed to help, especially poor black and Latino children. Real reform is not predicated upon individual success, but rather collective advance. We each can share stories about students that have overcome the odds. We know that poor black and Latino students in DC and across this nation can excel academically, and they have. But real progress cannot be measured by a student here and a student there, but rather by the progress of all students in Washington, D.C. and across the nation. In 1963, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a dream. And many people remember parts of that speech, but forget the nightmare that that dream came out of. Many forget that Jim Crow laws attempted to strip black Americans of their selfhood and of their dignity. And many forgot that he warned against a tranquilizing drug of gradualism and pushed for the fierce urgency of now. Maybe it's 1963 all over again, or maybe it's 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education. The children we are fighting for have been drowning in a sea of separate and unequal. The tranquilizing drug of gradualism, which will not bring them to the shores of academic excellence and parity. In particular, if we stick with the same Gray-Henderson strategy inaugurated by Reed, it will take 132 years for the same percentage of black students to reach proficiency in reading on NAEP and white students have now. 132 years. I hope it is clear to you that the children we're fighting for need you and me to be moved by the fierce urgency of now, to become filled with the passion of upsetting the status quo and challenging the voices that say, hold steady, keep the ship on course, and don't change it now. We're fighting to overcome the litany of low expectations and no expectations. Disproportionately high suspension rates compared with white students, can hardly read, can hardly write, an expanding achievement gap, diminished hope, school closings, inexperienced teachers, testing ad nauseum, and diminished creativity. There's something fundamentally wrong with a system in which a majority of black students are below basic in reading and below basic in math. These are the conditions we're fighting to reverse and overcome. There's so much history to explain this tragedy, but let us fast forward to the Business Roundtable, a group of CEOs of major corporations. In 1990, the Roundtable identified 9 essential components that education systems needed to implement together for their schools to be successful. These included professional development, a caring school climate, parental support, sufficient resources, and wraparound service. A Roundtable educator leader wrote that leaving any of the 9 components out of a reform agenda will sharply reduce the chances of success. But facing state legislatures, resistance to enacting all 9 components quickly mounted, and the Roundtable proposed that legislation mandate only 3. Only 3 out of the 9, even though we've told that it takes all 9 in order for it to be successful, to implement only 3 out of the 9. And those 3 are standards, assessment, and accountability. This faithfully launched what became a massive nationwide standard assessments and accountability movement, later federalized into the No Child Left Behind Act, the 2 principal sources of America's fixation with test and punishment as the dominant but arbitrary and unfounded strategy of school reform. Test and punishment is fundamentally misconceived as a strategy for improving low-achieving schools. It assumes that school staff already have the knowledge, skills, and resources to effectively educate their students. They only need to be pressured to work harder, but this assumption is widely false. Often these teachers need substantial help to raise their expectations and beliefs as to their students' academic potential and how to effectively engage their interests and teach them a challenging curriculum. Parents often need support in literacy and parenting skills to help their children learn at home. Community members must be actively engaged to provide services to overcome non-educational obstacles to learning. Simply pressuring school staff to do things beyond their capacity or be punished does nothing to address the underlying problems that prevent the schools from already being good schools. In Washington, D.C., under Fenty, Gray, school reform strategy has been driven by raising comprehensive assessment system, CAS scores, as the overriding objective. It is focused on firing teachers and principals for failing to sufficiently raise such scores, accessing and removing hundreds of teachers and other staff without needing to show cause, hiring hundreds of inexperienced and inadequately trained teachers, and closing 38 schools, all serving overwhelmingly black students east of Rock Creek Park. So where do we go to from here? Fortunately for the children we're fighting for, we don't have to invent a sound strategy for improving low-achieving schools to replace test and punishment. Research and experience show such a strategy already exists. The same strategy that low-achieving schools have actually used to successfully turn themselves around. This strategy is described in the paper, Common Elements of Successful School Turnarounds, 2010, by Gary Ratner and Monty Neal. Gary is here with us, and I'm thankful that he is a part of our team. They prepared this report, this paper, as at the invitation of a congressional committee. So instead of punishing school staff for failing to raise standardized test scores, this strategy focuses on helping low-achieving schools improve by instituting specific practices in each of 5 key areas: leadership, instructional improvement, curriculum, school climate, and parent and community involvement and support. While the details of the Common Element strategy can be found in the paper, in essence it consists of a multi-year process designed to change the school community's beliefs and expectations as to the students' educational potential and institute successful practices in each of the 5 areas. The strategy includes having a skilled and committed principal who develops a vision, gets staff, parents, and communities to embrace that vision, and creates a team of leaders to help implement that vision, providing for extensive collaboration among teachers, mentoring, and professional development to meet the particular needs of each school's teacher, providing a challenging, rich, and culturally relevant curriculum, creating a climate of high expectations for academic achievement and behavior by all students, respect, support, and safety, enhancing parents' skills to help their children learn at home, and providing school and wraparound community services to overcome students' non-academic obstacles to learning. What's required in DC and nationally is nothing less than a fundamental change in school reform strategy, from the failed test and punishment strategy to one that actually works. What I'm talking about is the antithesis of the top-down, micromanaged reform model that has been in place locally for the past 6 years and nationally for the past 10 years. We need a collective and collaborative model, a model that pays heed to the social and racial context in which schools operate, a model that honors the experiences of students, a model that recognizes not only that all children can learn, but all children can teach as well. Instead of punishing staff, we need to build cooperative and collective relationships at the building level, at the local level, at the individual school level. What I'm talking about is hard work, but it's way overdue for the children we're fighting for, and anything that you put together that actually works requires hard work. Unfortunately, we've come into this sort of easy idea of what works. We think that somehow if you have someone at the top like a mayor, who then has a chancellor, and then everything flows down, that somehow, just because it's streamlined, it works and it's effective and it's efficient. But there's whole kinds of problems with that. One is just simply being able to dialogue about your child's education. Who do you talk to if they don't want to listen, and if they're only accountable to the chancellor, and the chancellor is only accountable to the mayor, then you have effectively locked out grassroots participation in their children's education. When we're talking about this collaborative model, it's sort of to break down this balkanized climate that exists in the school and bring all parties to the table. Administrator, teacher, parents, community leaders, and students, to bring them to the table because each has a perspective on what is needed in the educational endeavor. We want to be a system where there are professionals and then there are all the rest, when in fact we're all engaged and should be engaged in the education of our children. So this collaborative model calls for a different kind of structure, and it requires much more work than is basically manifest right now, but hard work produces good results. As low-achieving schools become good schools, they will provide effective teaching and learning for their students, as good schools around the country already do. Tests will then merely confirm that the needed changes are being made and the schools are getting better. The overall role of DC public schools must be to do everything it can through policy, funding, technical support, and other means to help low-achieving schools implement the common elements. Specific actions that DC's public officials need to take to begin to bring about educational justice for the children we're fighting for include publicly admitting that DC public schools' test and punishment strategy has failed to effectively educate the low-income Black and Latino students it was supposed to help, and that it has failed to reduce the achievement gap between low-income and higher-income students. If it fails there in terms of reducing that achievement gap, it has failed. In fact, they've allowed the gap to become worse. And so there needs to be on anything the admission, first of all, that something isn't working in order to get down and roll up one sleeve and decide that you need to fix some things in order to make it work. We also need to engage parents and the community in discussions about the need to replace the current test, intimidate, and punish strategy with a strategy concentrating on helping low-achieving schools improve by implementing the common elements of successful school turnarounds. Gain their support to make this fundamental change. We also need to recruit and hire
as many principals as possible who have led significant improvements in low-achieving schools to lead turnarounds in Washington, D.C. Emphasize hiring principals who are familiar with Washington, D.C. and understand the economic, cultural, and social circumstance of its public school students and families, not just based on their resumes. Also, we need to give principals the authority to reach out to their communities and lead turnarounds, providing strong mentoring, peer collaboration, and other support for principals. Replace one-year contracts driven by a compulsion to raise test scores with at least 5-year contracts focused on implementing the common elements. We also need to hire teachers who have graduated from teachers' colleges or other teacher preparation programs that provide at least 1 year intensive supervised training in the classroom. No more teachers should be hired from programs providing merely several weeks of training. We need to become serious about our students. And we need to stop closing public schools east of Rock Creek Park, vastly, disproportionately injuring black students. We need to provide good public schools in every neighborhood that are resourced in proper ways that are appropriate to the context in which they exist. And when I say appropriate to the context in which they exist, you're not going to resource a school that you basically categorize right now as failing with the same resources that you're going to fund a school that is categorized as successful. You're going to need to put more funds and more resources and more energy in a place where the schools are failing in order to turn it around. So you cannot have this cookie-cutter model of your idea of reform and expect for it to work in places that it has not worked. The Fenty, Gray, Reed, Henderson, and national high-stakes testing strategies are fundamentally misconceived and ineffective as ways to improve low-achieving schools. They do not address the real problems. They cause severe harms to teachers, to principals, to students, to families, and to neighborhoods, especially black and brown neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. Now is the time for D.C. and America as a whole to put a stop to this ineffective and destructive so-called school reform strategy. We already know a good deal about what it takes to transform low-achieving schools, implement the common elements of successful school turnarounds. We know what that looks like. And when we do this, when we get the political will to do this, when we end up with the moral will to do this, we will provide teachers and principals and parents the respect and support they need to nurture our children as learners, and we will leave the devastating past behind. We will pay homage to mothers and fathers that dreamed of their children going further than they ever could go. You know, in Hebrews chapter 11, it reminds us that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. Dr. Samuel Proctor titles his book, The Evidence of Things Unseen. And he talks about, if you don't know Samuel Proctor, he was considered the dean of black preachers. And Samuel Proctor also was one of those who initiated and started the Peace Corps. And so Dr. Samuel Proctor talks about that he came from a place where his parents did not have the education, but his parents could see something that was just beyond their own experience. They could see something in the future for the children, could see something even though they have never touched it themselves, never saw it themselves, and never experienced it themselves. That's why he talks about the evidence of things unseen, because they believed that there was greater potential for their children. They believed that there was greater things to be accomplished if they only invested in their children being able to get there. And Dr. Samuel Proctor clearly was a shining example of what it meant to be one who was skilled and learned, one who could lead, one who could develop, and one who could inspire. When we do these things, when we take on this collective consciousness of changing schools and not punishing teachers and not punishing and shortchanging our students. When we do this, we will begin to see that the boy who used to hate reading will fall in love with words and books. We will see that the girl who used to fear writing will start penning her own stories and her own poems. That the boy who used to start fights will become a peacemaker and maybe become a preacher or a teacher. The girl who used to curse to express her hurt will become the new Maya Angelou. The boy who used to be a truant will start winning perfect attendance scores and will live up to that commitment of just showing up to show out, and to allow somehow a creative spirit to flow through his being. That there would be hope rather than diminished hope. That there would be high expectation rather than low expectation. That our children will be able to run on further than we ever imagined our children to run, if we only invest in their education and their development. On behalf of the children we're fighting for, I call, and we call, on the candidates for mayor, all the candidates for mayor, and all of the other candidates for D.C. City Council to publicly admit the failure of the Fenty Gray test and punishment school reform strategy to effectively educate poor Black and Latino children it was supposed to help. We call on the President of the United States, the Secretary of Education, and leaders of Congress to admit the failures of the test and punishment strategy embedded in No Child Left Behind. We call on all our elected officials in Washington, D.C. and at the national level to endorse a new strategy that actually works, helping schools improve by implementing the common elements of successful school turnarounds. And we urge the voters of this city and the citizens of this nation to join our fight. Join our fight for what's right. Join our fight for hope and for tomorrow and for our children. No matter where you live, you can join our fight at HaglerForDC.com. And you can help us to win for the children. Not just for an individual, but for our children collectively. As children of God, just like children on the other side of town, they deserve a good education. I want to recognize that Liz Davis has come into the room, who's president of the Washington Teachers Union. Amen. And welcome. And one of the things I also am delighted in the endorsement of the Washington Teachers Union and for your faith in my leadership and my work. One of the things that we know is that teachers have been through it. They have been through it in Washington, D.C. They have been lied to like our children have been lied to. They have been messed over like our children have been messed over. I remember, and many of us remember a while back when teachers were just laid off because there were no funds. And 6 months later they turned around and they said, oh, we made a mistake. And all the teachers have been ground up in the process, which only demonstrates that it's really not about our children right now. And we got to make sure that it's focused back on our children. And it's back on that endeavor, that covenant that should exist in the classroom. It should be back focused on that community endeavor that exists in the local schools and with the community that lives around those local schools. It needs to be invested back in our parents in order for us to truly make an effective difference in the education of our children. Thank you for being here. God bless you.